Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the review of Cambodia. In accordance with the Resolution 5/1, the review is based on the national report, as well as the compilation of UN information and the summary of stakeholders' information, both prepared by the OHCHR. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Keo Remy, President of the Cambodian Human Rights Committee, to introduce the report. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, allow me to introduce my colleague. I'm here with Excellency Naisamal, Permanent Representative of Cambodia to the UN in Geneva. Excellency Edradi, Vice President of Cambodian Human Rights Committee. Excellency Chin Malin, the Vice President, and also representative from the Ministry of Justice, Excellency Kataon, the member of CHRC, Cambodian Human Rights Committee, Excellency Monhon, representative from Ministry of Interior, Excellency Mawana from Ministry of Labor, Excellency Mansachet and Kumswandi, both representative from Ministry of Social Affairs, Excellency Soksuken and Excellency Semviria, representative, the both representative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Excellency Nguyen Chinlin Polan, representative from the Ministry of Information. Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegate, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it is our great pleasure and honor today to attend the 32nd session of the UPR Working Group Interactive Dialogue and at the beautiful and historical city of Geneva. Today, I wish to highlight that my statement will focus on three main aspects. Firstly, the achievement that Cambodia has attained so far in regard to the promotion and protection of the human rights. Secondly, further concrete steps to strengthen democracy, rule of law, and human rights in Cambodia. And finally, the commitment of the government in fulfilling its obligation to promote, protect, and respect human rights and fundamental freedom. This year marked the 40-year anniversary of the Cambodia liberation from the genocidal Pol Pot regime. It was the regime under which the human rights of all Cambodians, including the right to life, were totally deprived. Emerging from the bloodline of life and death in 1979, the government resolved and has remained committed to protect Cambodians and not allowing the possibility of falling again into such dark and atrocious time of genocide and crimes against humanity, as well as endless interventionist armed struggle, achieving the basic human rights that every citizen is entitled to was and still remain today the first and foremost important task for the government. Cambodia, previously well known as an insecure place, a dangerous minefield, is now a country that enjoys full peace, a popular destination in Southeast Asia, welcoming millions of tourists every year, and a cultural showcase. Cambodia, previously well known for armed struggle, for power and changes of governments, is now a country that firmly respects the principle of liberal multi-party democracy by regularly holding free, fair, and just elections that allow its citizens to choose the country leadership. A state governed by rule of law that firmly adheres to legal principles, and sovereign state of full independence and territorial integrity. The Paris Peace Accord of the 1991 ended the decades-long civil war of attrition in Cambodia. However, it was not until 1998 that the full peace came to prevail all over the country under the win-win policy of Prime Minister Samdech Hun Sen. With this full peace comes development. Economically speaking, Cambodia, previously perceived as economically underdeveloped country, mired in poverty and food insecurity, is now a food exporting country. One of the fastest growing economy in the world and a great performer in terms of poverty reduction and improvement in social indicators. The World Bank gave evaluation that Cambodia growth has been pro-poor. Cambodia has made significant progress in attaining the Millennium Development Goals. Since 1990, the country has more than half extreme poverty and maternal mortality, achieved nearly universal primary education enrollment, and made significant progress in combating HIV/AIDS. Cambodia grew at the average rate of the 7% in the last 2 decades and became a lower middle-income economy in 2016. Cambodia will likely transit out of its least developed country status after 2025 if it can maintain this growth rate. The Royal Government of the 6th Legislature has just introduced Rectangular Strategy Phase 4 to respond to 2 historic missions of the nation. Firstly, striving forward with firm belief to fully achieve sustainable development goals. And secondly, creating the necessary precondition and environment conducive for laying the strong foundation to become an upper middle income country by 2030. And for in-depth transformation of the Cambodia into a high-income country by 2050. In terms of protection and promotion of human rights, the consistent commitment from Cambodia in cooperation with the UN is well documented. Cambodia has employed a wide range of mechanisms, such as the continued presence of the Special Rapporteur, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, participation in the Universal Periodic Review, and the obligation to report the various treaty body mechanisms. Cambodia is a state party to 8 core UN human rights treaties, which it has ratified without reservation, and it is the only country in Asia to host the field office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. As far as the UPR is concerned, the government accepted 162 recommendations out of the 205 recommendations received during the second cycle, amounting for 79.5%. This high acceptance of the recommendation further reflects strong commitment and seriousness that the government has made and continue to make toward the promotion and protection of the human rights. After accepting the 162 recommendations in the second cycle of the UPR Cambodia Human Rights Committee, CHRC, as the government agency had cooperated with the OHCHR in Cambodia to compile the recommendation and organize workshops to disseminate those recommendations to all relevant line ministry institutions of the government for implementation. CHRC also follow up with the implementation of those line ministries and receive feedback on their achievement, which are all included in the state report for the third cycle of review. In preparing the current state report, CHRC had been consulting and working closely with the relevant stakeholders in Cambodia, such as the government institutions, civil society organizations, and OHCHR office in Cambodia. Mr. Vice President, to uphold the aforementioned invaluable achievement and to improve the political climate and democratic space for citizens to exercise their legitimate right and freedom in the spirit of the national reconciliation, the Royal Government of Cambodia would like to underline its position and further steps to be taken as follows. The election of the 6th Legislature of the National Assembly on 29 July 2018 was conducted in free, fair, peaceful, and transparent manner. 20 registered political parties contested in the voting, and 83.02% of the registered voters cast their ballot to express their desire to see continuity in the country's sustained path of peace, stability, democracy, and the rule of law. Legal action against political party violating the law is the normal process in any democratic state in adhering to the principle of the rule of law, strengthening the process of democracy and safeguarding peace and stability, which serve as the basis for long-term sustainable socio-economic development. It is the application for the seat allocation method adopted in 2014 with validation for the former opposition, which led to the winning of the Cambodian People's Party, CPP, of all the 125 seats with it 76.78% of the votes. Nevertheless, the royal government has set up participatory consultative mechanism with all political parties in Cambodia known as Supreme Council, Consultative Council, to collect multifaceted input for the benefit of national construction. This council creates a public consultative forum with the process of legal and policy formulation and implementation, and also check and balance platform with government through their monitoring mechanism, criticism, comments, and recommendations provided to the government to be addressed. The royal government has also called on judiciary as an independent body to expedite the trial proceedings of the trade union leaders and activists who are being sued or charged according to the prevailing court procedure, so as to safeguard their rights as granted under the Constitution. The royal government is strongly committed to promoting genuine partnership with civil society organizations, CSO, in all aspects of social development. Cambodia wishes to refer to several positive points raised by UN Special Rapporteur Professor Rona Smith in her end of mission statement dated 8 November 2018. She welcomed the recent creation of the government working group under the leadership of the Ministry of Interior to consult regularly with the civil society. A preparatory meeting was held on 7 December 2018, and the second forum on partnership between the government and CSO was held on 17 January 2019. The fora were attended by hundreds of CSO without discrimination, and constructive discussion has resulted in various tangible action in facilitating activity of the CSO. Parallelly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs International Cooperation organized a consultative forum with foreign and international NGO on 29 January 2019. Such fora, inclusive and collaborative in spirit, will aim to enhance better understanding on various issues surrounding the implementation of the Lango and other laws related to the CSO. The royal government has introduced a number of steps to address matters related to labor and trade union rights. Among those, the royal government has established a national committee for the review of international conventions, which Cambodia has ratified to consult with relevant stakeholders, as well as International Labour Organization ILO. The Ministry of Labour Vocational Training had also submitted a roadmap to ILO last July to respond to the 10-point recommendations adopted at the 106th International Labour Conference in 2017. The Ministry of Labour has also set up a working group to organize consultative fora with the professional organization, representative of employer and employee, as well as a relevant stakeholder to address the challenges in the implementation of the trade union law. The working group will also conduct consultation to collect suggestions from the stakeholder to improve the trade union law as necessary, to promote the working condition and protect the right of workers both inside and outside of Cambodia. The royal government of Cambodia, especially Samdech Techo Prime Minister of Cambodia, has paid high attention through direct meeting with workers since 20 August 2017 and by 25 January 2019. There were 63 meetings with nearly 1 million workers. The purpose of the regular meeting is to understand better the working condition of workers and to address some substantial issue of workers at the factory. As the result, the meeting have been bringing a lot of benefit to workers. The minimum wage for workers in the textile, garment, and footwear industry have reached $182 beginning January 2019, from $170 last year. Wage has more than doubled from $80 in 2013. The threshold income tax has been raised to $300 per month to ensure that the new wage gain will not be taxed. Non-salary allowance and benefit the worker receive will also continue to remain outside the tax threshold calculation. The employer are now required to pay 3.4% of each employee monthly average salary into the National Social Security Fund, NSSF, to cover for injury insurance and health care. A pension for workers in the government sector was also announced to come into effect in 2019. Female employees are entitled to a 3-month maternity leave with 120% salary, co-shared by 70% from the National Social Security Fund and 50% from employer. Such initiative is very unique and is strongly welcomed by the UN Special Rapporteur. For the union that are embedded in court cases, the Royal Government has been paying close attention to expedite the resolution in accordance with existing law and procedure to ensure promotion of the right and freedom of the union in protecting worker rights. The Royal Government also cherishes promotion of freedom of press and freedom of expression in accordance with the Constitution and law in force. Previously, there were complaints that freedom of press has been restricted, particularly regarding to the Cambodia Daily, Radio Free Asia, and Voice of America. For the cases, here are the facts. The Cambodia Daily shut down its publication on its own due to its failure to fulfill tax obligation in accordance with the law on taxation. In the event that such liability are legally met, the newspaper can resume its operation. The closer Radio Free Asia and Voice America representative office was self-initiated. The 2 radio stations are free to reopen the offices in Cambodia. The Prime Minister also set up regular meetings and gatherings with the media organization in Cambodia once a year to strengthen the cooperation between government and media, and the partnership and participation with the government in fighting against corruption and developing every aspect of society through the professionalism in providing and releasing information to the government and society. The meeting has been conducted 3 times. The last week was just held on January 11, 2019. Moreover, in order to promote and protect the right to information, the government is also working further on policy and legal framework and committed to complete the draft law on right to access to information together with other 2 important laws, cybercrime law and amendment of law on press regime, at the same time to ensure the consistency and legal harmonization in this 6th mandate of Parliament. Although the land management system in Cambodia has been completely destroyed by war and genocidal regime, the Royal Government has introduced policy and legal frameworks to manage the land sector so as to ensure the right and interest of people and proper land use. Pertaining of the sugarcane, the Royal Government has made great effort to coordinate to completely resolve the outstanding claim. For the remaining cases in Kokong and Previa provinces, the Ministry of Land, Urban Planning and Construction will establish a working group to settle all those issues and welcome participation from representatives of the EU, CSO, as well as the local community. The Royal Government will also continue to address other pending land disputes, promote, accelerate nationwide land registration, including that for indigenous community, provide social land concession and land for production to landless people, as well as provide incentive to development of affordable housing. The Royal Government Cambodia is counting on support all relevant stakeholders to contribute in the above effort to ensuring a peaceful, harmonious society with full respect for the rule of law, democracy and human rights. All human rights, including the right to development, shall be indivisible, and human rights issues must be addressed within the global context through the constructive, non-confrontational, non-politicized, dialogue-based approach, respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, impartiality and non-selective have been set as the guiding principle in promoting human rights, taking into account our political, historical, and social context of each country. Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, I would like to take this opportunity to reassure that Cambodia remains committed to strengthening close cooperation and constructive partnership with all the UN human rights mechanisms and relevant stakeholders in order to further enhance the promotion of protection human rights in the country. But at the same time, we also wish to suggest that all cooperation and partnership should be based on mutual respect. Interfering in two matters which are within the domestic jurisdiction of member states should be avoided as clearly stipulated in Article 27 of the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency for the statement and for his presence with us this afternoon. We shall now begin with our interactive dialogue. Before giving the floor to delegations for their questions and comments, I would like to remind you that the speaking time will be 1 minute and 30 seconds for all. I invite all delegations to adhere to the established time limit, as I would prefer to avoid interrupting the speaker. Again, as your statements will be interpreted, please deliver them at a reasonable pace. As was mentioned earlier, I urge states to prevent any act of intimidation or reprisal against individuals and groups who cooperate or have cooperated with the United Nations and its representatives and mechanisms in the field of human rights. It is crucial to ensure adequate protection against such acts. And last but not least, I would like to reiterate that the use of the words recommend or recommendation will ensure that the relevant parts of your statements are included in the recommendation section of the report of the working group. I now have the honor to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. You have the floor.
The Chinese delegation warmly welcomed the high-level delegation of Cambodia to the third cycle of UPR. In recent years, led by the royal government of Cambodia and with the joint efforts of people of Cambodia, Cambodia has maintained political stability and economic growth, and the people's living standard has been improved, and there has been progress in human rights. Cambodia has made great efforts to alleviate poverty, enhance the judicial guarantee of human rights, and developed education, health, and safeguarded the rights of vulnerable groups, including women, children, and people with disability. We firmly support Cambodia to embark on the road of development befitting its own conditions, while providing human rights technical assistance to Cambodia. The international community should take into full account the conditions of Cambodia and respect the wills of the people and government of Cambodia. We'd like to put forward two recommendations. One, continue to maintain social stability and promote sustainable economic and social development to improve people's living standard and further reduce the rate of poverty. Second, continue to develop education so as to better guarantee the right of people to education. We wish Cambodia a great success in the review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Colombia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Colombia would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia and thank it for the presentation of its report. We emphasize the progress made concerning the guarantee for the rights of persons with disabilities in domestic legislation in Cambodia. In a respectful and constructive vein, Colombia would like, first of all, to recommend that Cambodia sign up to the second optional protocol of the ICCPR aimed at abolishing the death penalty, and secondly, that they adopt measures aimed at guaranteeing freedom of expression and the full enjoyment of civil and political rights for the entire population. Thank you very much, Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Costa Rica.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you very much, Vice President. The Costa Rican delegation would like to wish a very warm welcome to the Cambodian delegation and thank it for the presentation of its third national report. We're pleased to welcome the establishment of a national mechanism to combat torture and the implementation of a national strategic plan for disability. Furthermore, we'd like to take the opportunity to urge the Government of Cambodia to cooperate constructively with mandate holders and the special procedures, both before and during and after country visits. My delegation respectfully recommends that, one, the country establish the necessary conditions to ensure that all individuals can fully enjoy their fundamental rights, particularly freedom of expression, association and peaceful meeting. Secondly, step up the establishment of a national human rights institute in line with the Paris Principles. And thirdly, that they sign up to the optional protocol for the ICCPR aimed at abolishing the death penalty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire is absent. The next speaker on the list is Croatia. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Croatia welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks them for the presentation of their third UPR report. Croatia commends Cambodia for the steps taken to implement recommendations on the protection of children by developing laws and policies on violence against children and child labor. We would also like to acknowledge progress achieved in the area of education. However, we must echo the concern expressed by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia about children from indigenous and ethnic minority groups who still suffer disadvantages, including in relation to the availability of education. Croatia remains concerned with the state of fundamental freedoms and the right to participate in public and political life in Cambodia. The onslaught on civil society, independent media and political opposition has profound consequences on the state of human rights in the country. Mr. Vice President, allow us to address Cambodia with two recommendations. One, issue a standing invitation to all UN special procedures and engage constructively with the OHCHR and UN special procedures. Second, end harassment and arbitrary arrests of human rights defenders, members of the political opposition, activists and journalists. Croatia compliments the government of Cambodia for the progress achieved and wishes them a successful review session. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you very much, Vice President. We'd like to wish a warm welcome to the delegation of Cambodia and thank them for the presentation of their national report, which reflects actions carried out to implement the recommendations from the previous review, in particular the update of the legal framework. I'd like to emphasize the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Disabilities and the National Plan to Reduce Child Labour, as well as other measures to protect children. We recommend to Cambodia that, one, they continue their efforts to progress with the elimination of poverty, in particular in rural areas, and secondly, that they implement activities to continue broadening out the quality and access to and of services of health and education with equity. We wish every success to Cambodia for this review.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of Cambodia. We commend Cambodia's achievements in reducing poverty. We also appreciate its proactive stance towards the UPR process. On the other hand, much remains to be done with regard to implementation of the recommendations. We hope that the upcoming voluntary national review of Cambodia at the 2019 UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, with a special focus on the SDG 16, will provide a needed impetus for further efforts. In the meantime, we will continue to closely follow the ongoing process on the EBA trade scheme led by the European Commission. In line with our previous recommendations, as well as statements in this Council, we recommend, firstly, to revise the penal code as well as other laws in order to comply with international human rights standards, including the law on associations and non-governmental organizations, the awaited trade union law, and the telecommunications law. Secondly, to step up efforts preventing harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, trade union workers, protesters, land and other civil society actors, and protect their rights. Thirdly, to strengthen cooperation with the UN special procedures, issue and implement a standing invitation to all special procedures before the next UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of the DPR Korea warmly welcomes the delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia, headed by His Excellency Mr. Keo Remy, the President of the Cambodia Human Rights Committee, and notes with appreciation its third national report as well as the additional information provided today. We commend the royal government of Cambodia for its strenuous efforts and achievements made since 2014, including a number of the measures taken to strengthen the judicial and institutional framework for human rights and improving the socio-economic life of people. It is well noted and encouraging that significant progress has been made, particularly in the fields of the poverty reduction, realizing education for all policy, improving the public health service, combating child labor and human trafficking. My delegation wishes the government of Cambodia the best in its future endeavor and recommend the following. 1. To further enhance its efforts to improve the quality of education and promote the program for access to education for all, in particular in primary education. 2. To fully implement the policy and share good practice in combating tuberculosis and HIV and AIDS. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Denmark welcomes the delegation of Cambodia. Denmark remains deeply concerned by the situation concerning fundamental political and civil rights in Cambodia, including the dissolution of the main opposition party. Denmark recommends the government to bring laws, regulations and policies on freedom of expression, association and public assembly into accordance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Cambodian constitution recognizes the right to education and children's rights. Unfortunately, girls leave school earlier than boys and thereby lag behind in education. Better educated girls and women tend to contribute substantially to social development and enable better health care and education for their children, should they choose to become mothers. Denmark therefore recommends the government to develop concrete measures aimed at ensuring the effective retention of girls in school. Denmark wishes Cambodia a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Egypt. You have the floor.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. يرحب وفد مصر بالوفد رفيع المستوى لكمبوديا ويهنئها على تقديم التقرير الوطني ويثمن الجهود التي تقوم بها الحكومة لتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان. كما نثمن الموافقة على إنشاء مؤسسة وطنية مستقلة لحقوق الإنسان والجهود الحثيثة في مجال دعم استقلال السلطة القضائية وترسيخ سيادة القانون، فضلا عن جهود حماية وتعزيز حقوق
institution, and also to issue the a national plan for 2014-2018. Egypt's delegation would like to submit the following recommendations. 1. Ratifying the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all the migrant workers and their families, and 2nd, pursue progress in order to enhance social and economic development and provide education for all to all the categories of citizens. To conclude, we would like to wish Cambodia all success in its endeavor to enhance social and economic development. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Fiji.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Fiji welcomes the delegation of the Royal Government of Cambodia and thanks it for the continued engagement in this UPR process. Fiji is well aware of Cambodia's vulnerability to climate-related flooding, drought, and irregular weather patterns. Climate-related flooding increases water-related and vector-borne diseases, and extended droughts also negatively impacts health by reducing the availability of nutritious food, water, sanitation, and hygiene. Fiji congratulates the Royal Government of Cambodia for the steady increase in the share of its national budget allocated to climate expenditure and the investment to climate change, which has tripled over the last 8 years, demonstrating its firm commitment to addressing climate change. Fiji also congratulates Cambodia for its National Strategic Plan on Disaster Risk Management for Health and its Climate Change Strategic Plan. Fiji recommends that the Royal Government of Cambodia continue to effectively address the special vulnerabilities, views and needs of women, children, persons with disabilities, and local and marginalized communities when implementing its National Strategic Plan on Disaster Risk Management for Health and its Climate Change Strategic Plan. Fiji wishes the Royal Government of Cambodia every success in the cause of its UPR. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Finland.
Mr. Vice President, Finland welcomes the delegation of Cambodia to the UPR and thanks for the presentation of the national report. Finland is concerned of the shrinking civic and democratic space in Cambodia, and particularly of the restrictions on freedoms of association, assembly and expression through repressive laws and regulations. Finland wishes to make the following 2 recommendations. Firstly, in order to actively guarantee human rights in Cambodia, Finland recommends Cambodia to cease all kinds of harassment and arbitrary interference with political opposition, human rights defenders and labor activists, and to amend laws and regulations effectively used to limit freedoms of association and assembly, such as certain provisions in the law on political parties, the law on associations and non-governmental organizations, and the law on trade unions. Second, Finland recommends Cambodia to amend laws and regulations, including the law on telecommunications and the interministerial prakas on publication controls of website and social media processing via internet that effectively limit freedom of expression, and to end all forms of interference in and surveillance of media channels and online speech. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to France.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to thank the delegation of Cambodia. We welcome the efforts of the government to reduce poverty and improve the health system as well as social protection. We had expressed our concern at the restrictive measures adopted against civil and political rights prior to the 2018 elections, and we have taken note of the positive steps the government has taken to reopen political space and encourage these measures. We recommend that Cambodia take the necessary measures to allow members of the opposition to participate in Cambodian political life, that it take the measures to re-establish an environment which upholds the rights of civil society, in particular by revising the associations law and the law on NGOs. Third, that it guarantee freedom of expression and opinion of all citizens and journalists, including on internet, by amending the latest constitutional revision as well as the interministerial instruction of May 2018 allowing the surveillance of internet content. Fourth, effectively establish the working group on land conflict under the aegis of the Ministry of Land Management, in which the civil society and European Union must participate. Fifth, establish a committee for the oversight of international conventions ratified by Cambodia with the participation of ILO. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Georgia welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks President of the Human Rights Committee, Mr. Keo, for the presentation of the national report. We know the adoption of laws strengthening judiciary system's independence and encourage the Kingdom of Cambodia to continue a reform process in this direction. We positively view the establishment of national anti-torture independent mechanism which works in line with OPCAT and cooperates with the UN Subcommittee Against Torture in the Asia Pacific. And we encourage the government to further expand the cooperation with the United Nations. Georgia appreciates that the royal government has taken steps to protect rights of persons with disabilities in line with the National Disability Strategic Plan. With this, Georgia would like to recommend to the royal government, first, to accelerate procedures for the adoption of the draft law on the establishment of national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris principles, and second, to intensify efforts to combat trafficking persons, including women and children. We wish the delegation of Cambodia a very successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany.
I thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Cambodia. We commend improvements in the protection of the rights of children and increased efforts to fight human trafficking. Germany recommends 1. Seize excessive powers of the executive branch to influence the work of judges and prosecutors by amending the law on organization of the courts, the law on the statute of judges and prosecutors, and the law on the organization and functioning of the Supreme Council of the Magistracy. 2. In consultation with affected stakeholders and civil society, amend the law on political parties and the law on associations and non-governmental organizations (NANGO) to bring them into line with international human rights obligations. 3. Bring the criminal code into line with Article 19 of the ICCPR by repealing or amending articles on insulting the king, defamation, insult, incitement, unlawful coercion of judicial authorities, and discrediting judicial decisions. 4. Ensure freedom of expression on the Internet by revoking the Interministerial Decree number 170 on publication controls of websites and social media processing via the Internet. And 5. Issue a standing invitation to the UN special procedures and cooperate constructively with the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Cambodia and with the OHCHR. We wish you a successful UPR. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Greece.
Mr. Vice President, Greece welcomes the delegation of Cambodia to the 32nd session of the UPR Working Group. We would like to note Cambodia's progress in respect of LGBTIQ inclusion, as well as the development of a safety net for the most vulnerable, including persons with disabilities. However, we cannot but express our deep concern for the important worsening of the overall human rights situation in the country. Greece has a long-standing position as regards the rights of journalists. Greece therefore recommends that Cambodia create an enabling environment for a free and pluralistic media, including by ceasing judicial harassment against journalists and abuse of tax regulations to harass media outlets and associations. Greece also recommends that Cambodia 1. Revoke trade union registration and reporting requirements that result in the restriction of the freedoms of association, assembly and expression. 2. Amend LANGO to bring it in line with Cambodia's obligations under the ICCPR. 3. Create the conditions for genuine multi-party democracy in the country and for free and fair elections to take place. 4. Establish regional appeals courts in accordance with the law on organization of courts and ensure their proper operationalization by 2023. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Haiti. Haiti is absent. The next speaker on my list is Honduras. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Honduras welcomes the distinguished delegation from Cambodia and thanks it for the report. We congratulate it for progress made and results obtained in the implementation of the recommendations received during previous UPRs and recognize the ratification of 8 key human rights treaties. We welcome the voluntary commitments of Cambodia and in a spirit of, and these have been done in a spirit of cooperation. In that same spirit, we would like respectfully to recommend that 1, they consider signing up to the international instruments and human rights instruments it is not yet party to. Secondly, that it redouble efforts aimed to promote tolerance, particularly for the special procedures, and 3, that it strengthen the measures aimed at preventing and combating trafficking in persons. Finally, we'd like to reiterate our support for all of the actions of Cambodia taken under this UPR, and we wish them every success. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Iceland welcomes the delegation of Cambodia. Iceland welcomes the royal government's positive steps towards promoting human rights and its consistent support for the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Iceland makes the following recommendations. 1. Introduce an anti-discrimination law which guarantees and explicitly prohibits all kinds of discrimination, including on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. 2. Introduce a gender recognition law. 3. Amend the Constitution to ensure marriage equality for same-sex couples. 4. Abolish the discriminatory prohibition on women remarrying within 120 days following a divorce or annulment. 5. Align laws such as the law on associations and non-governmental organizations, the trade union law, the law on political parties, and the telecommunications law with international obligations. 6. Repeal provisions of the criminal code which can be used to restrict the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association, and decriminalize offenses such as defamation. 7. Take all measures to protect and support journalists, human rights defenders, trade union workers, land and environmental activists, and other civil society actors and members of the political opposition. I wish Cambodia all success for its review. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to India.
President, India welcomes the delegation of Cambodia. India commends Cambodia on reducing poverty rate and on becoming a lower middle-income country. Cambodia has been implementing mechanisms such as payment exemption policy, equity funding programs, social security system, which are key to poverty reduction and promote equity health care services. The National Policy Framework for Social Protection and the Health Strategic Plan are important steps to ensure that the people of Cambodia can avail qualitative, safe and effective health care system in all public and private health facilities. The progress made by Cambodia in the primary and secondary education and ensuring high enrollment of girls in higher education are commendable. India appreciates various measures taken by Cambodia for promotion and protection of the rights of persons with disabilities. India also notes the steps taken towards establishing a national human rights institution. India recommends the following to Cambodia: continue ongoing mechanisms for ensuring poverty reduction, continue ongoing measures to promote education for all, continue ongoing policies and programs for ensuring quality health care for all, continue ongoing mechanisms for gender parity and women's empowerment. We wish Cambodia every success in its future endeavors. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia. Indonesia welcomes the establishment of the National Committee Against Torture, other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment punishment in August 2017. The adoption of National Strategic Plan on Disability 2014-2018 is also commendable. We also applaud the implementation of Strategic Plan for Gender Mainstreaming in 29 ministries' institutions to further promote gender equality in public services. To complement such positive development, Indonesia recommends Cambodia the following: continue to strengthen efforts in establishing a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Fortify efforts to effectively implement the law on suppression of trafficking in person and sexual exploitation to better prevent and address human trafficking. To take further steps in providing access to education for all, by increasing equitable education services to all children and youth at both formal and informal education system. As a fellow ASEAN member state, we wish Cambodia a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to welcome the members of the delegation of Cambodia and thank them for the implementation of the recommendations of the second cycle. My delegation commends the efforts of the government to promote human rights in terms of education and the training of law enforcement officials and civil servants. We witness in the country some positive steps in the area of human rights, such as creation of the National Committee Against Torture and the Cambodian Human Rights Committee, enactment of the Administration of Criminal Justice Act in 2015, and the efforts to combat trafficking in persons, especially women and children. Despite the progress made, we would like to make the following recommendations: to continue its efforts to improve its healthcare infrastructure in general and easier access to public health system and maternal services for women in particular, to reduce poverty among persons, to to reduce poverty among persons with disabilities and access to National Social Security Fund in the coming years, to increase the efforts to achieve economic and social rights of the people, particularly through sustained economic growth and social inclusion. My delegation wishes Cambodia every success in the process. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Iraq.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. يرحب وفد جمهورية العراق برئيس وأعضاء وفد كمبوديا المشارك لتقديم تقريره الثالث، ويقدر الجهود المبذولة في إعداده.
Mr. President, the implementation of Cambodia of the recommendations of the previous UPR reflects its willingness to improve the situation of human rights in the country. We have noted with satisfaction the developments in that country, and we consider that organizing training sessions for law enforcement officers and for judges will contribute to achieving these goals and will also reduce the poverty rates. And Iraq would like to submit the following recommendations. 1. Pursuing the efforts aiming at establishing the National Institution for Human Rights according to the Paris Principles. 2. Intensifying the efforts aiming at preventing human trafficking. And 3. Overcoming the obstacles hindering the access of women victims of violence to justice. To conclude, we wish Cambodia all success in this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks it for its presentation today. Ireland acknowledges Cambodia's efforts to advance human rights domestically and commends areas of progress made since the last UPR cycle, including work in preventing human trafficking through the signing of the ASEAN Consensus on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers. Ireland makes the following recommendations to the Cambodian authorities. 1. That Cambodia adhere to international standards on the independence of institutions, notably the Judiciary and the National Election Commission, to ensure that electoral processes are free, fair and transparent. 2. To create conditions conducive to free political debate and competition with a view to rebuilding a democracy in which the media and civil society, including human rights defenders, can freely carry out their work without interference or hindrance as recommended by Ireland in the previous cycle, and in particular to ensure that their work is not hindered by restrictions on the freedoms of assembly or expression, either online or offline. We wish Cambodia every success with this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Italy.
Italy welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia and thanks for the national report and today's presentation. Italy seizes this occasion to present the following recommendation. Strengthen efforts to protect the rights of the most vulnerable groups, such as women, children and persons with disabilities, also in order to prevent and combat child labor and sexual exploitation, as well as other forms of violence, including domestic violence. Protect the rights of human rights defenders and bring laws, regulation and policy on freedom of expression, association and assembly into accordance with international obligations. Step up efforts in land matters, including through the effective and transparent implementation of measures to tackle land evictions and provide with fair compensation to victims of land grabbing, particularly indigenous people. Continue to implement measures to strengthen the independence of both the judiciary and the media. Engage constructively with all UN special procedures. We wish Cambodia a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Vice President. Japan warmly welcomes the Cambodian delegation. Japan would like to submit 2 recommendations. First, to promote dialogue among the political actors, freedom and rights of the people and the democratic process in order to unite the people towards development. In this process, ensure an environment in which the rights of all political actors, the civil society, the media and others are respected and their activities are not constrained. Second, to further advance judiciary reforms and establish an independent justice system that is trusted and utilized by the people. To this end, make maximum use of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia as a model. As regards the current situation, Japan welcomes Cambodia's recent extension of the MOU with the OHCHR office in Phnom Penh. We also look forward to concrete actions to be taken based on the government's recent statement on further steps to strengthen democracy and political space, so that democracy in Cambodia will progress steadily. Japan also expects Cambodia to strengthen oversight and control regarding entities involved in dispatching workers overseas, including to Japan, so that inappropriate brokers will be excluded. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. Vice President, the Lao People's Democratic Republic warmly welcome the high-level delegation of Cambodia to the 32nd session of the UPR Working Group and commends for its comprehensive national report on human rights. Laos sincerely commends the government of Cambodia for the achievements made in efforts to eliminate discrimination against women and promote gender equality through the development and implementation of legal frameworks, policy, action plans, and programs. We also commend Cambodia for the remarkable progress made in the education sector. In this connection, Laos has 3 recommendations. First, continue to upgrade quality and efficiency of education services and all general vocational and skill training schools. Second, continue to implement gender equality policy by mainstreaming gender in all sectors and programs. And third, strengthen roles and status of women and promote and protect child rights and disability persons in the society. We wish Cambodia every success in its UPR. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Latvia welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks it for presenting national report. Latvia notes measures taken by the royal government of Cambodia in the field of promotion and protection of human rights in the previous review and encourages further efforts in fulfilling human rights obligations and commitments. Latvia notes received visits from the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia and accepted visit requests by the Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities and independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. However, Latvia notes with regret the lack of cooperation with other special procedure mandate holders of the Human Rights Council. Latvia would like to reiterate following recommendations. 1. Strengthen cooperation with the special procedures of the Human Rights Council by responding positively to the pending visit requests by the special procedure mandate holders, and eventually consider extending a standing invitation to all special procedures mandate holders. 2. Continue exploring possibilities to extend its international commitments by ratifying the optional protocols to the ICCPR. Latvia wishes to the delegation of Cambodia success in the review. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Lithuania warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cambodia and thanks it for the presentation of national report. We acknowledge Cambodia's efforts in improving its human rights situation in certain areas, and we urge Cambodian government to consolidate its actions in addressing serious human rights challenges that still persist. Lithuania would like to make the following recommendations. First, take all necessary steps to strengthen the rule of law and to guarantee full judicial independence consistent with international human rights standards. Second, redouble the efforts to protect freedom of opinion and expression, both online and offline, to ensure and promote a safe environment for journalists, human rights defenders, and political opposition, and to effectively and thoroughly investigate all attacks against them. Third, take necessary measures to ensure that the right to freedom of assembly and association is not hindered by arbitrary restrictions or excessive use of force. In conclusion, Lithuania wishes Cambodia success in this UPR and in implementing its recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malaysia warmly welcomes the delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia to the 32nd session of the UPR Working Group and congratulates them for the presentation of their national report. Economic development and growth are imperative to improve living conditions and promote livelihood of Cambodians. While Malaysia is pleased with efforts undertaken towards promoting socio-economic development, we believe that improvements could be further made. In this regard, we recommend Cambodia to continue implementing policies to promote economic growth and implement wide-ranging programs to alleviate poverty. Malaysia notes Cambodia's progress in improving access to healthcare services. Under the Health Strategic Plan 2016 to 2020, everyone, including those living in rural areas, are able to obtain quality healthcare services. We also note that the government is continuing efforts to curb tuberculosis by providing free treatment. Malaysia recommends that these efforts to be sustained and relevant policies aimed to total eradication of tuberculosis to be fully implemented. As a fellow member of ASEAN, Malaysia appreciates Cambodia's ongoing policies and programs aimed at improving human rights in the country and join the many friends of Cambodia in wishing it a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the delegation from Cambodia to this third cycle of UPR review and thanks for the presentation today. The Maldives recognizes Cambodia's efforts to protect the rights of its people, including the Health Strategic Plan 2016-2020, the National Policy Framework for Social Protection 2016-2025, and the National Anti-Torture Mechanism, among others, that have been adopted. In constructive spirit, the Maldives presents the following recommendations to Cambodia. 1. Continue to step up measures aimed at promoting women's rights, including elimination of all forms of discrimination and violence against women. 2. Continue to ensure the effective implementation of the National Action Plan on Reducing Child Labour 2016-2025. We wish Cambodia every success at this review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to Mexico.
Thank you very much, Vice President. We wish a very warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of Cambodia and thank them for the presentation of their report. We appreciate the progress made, and among them would like to emphasize the establishment of a national mechanism against torture and the establishment of a legal protection department for women under the aegis of the Ministry of Women's Affairs. In the hope of strengthening this progress, we respectfully recommend 1. The establishment of an independent national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles. Secondly, strengthening the efforts made to ensure birth registration of all those born in Cambodia, including minorities and those populations in zones difficult to access, such as border communities. Thirdly, that they sign up to the second optional protocol of the ICCPR and that they take steps to abolish the death penalty. And fourthly, that in consultation with civil society organizations, they adopt comprehensive legislation and policy aimed at combating discrimination and violence for reasons of sexual orientation or gender identity, and that they guarantee its implementation through all public bodies, in particular in the educational, health and labour sectors. We wish every success to Cambodia during this review. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Montenegro.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cambodia. We commend the continuous efforts of the government to improve the human rights situation by adopting laws and strategies, as well as by conducting the trainings and campaigns for all representatives of the state authorities across the country. We welcome the efforts of the government to strengthen the protection of children's rights, particularly street children and orphans. However, we noted concerns of some UN treaty bodies over the sexual exploitation of children and urge the government to investigate all cases of child sex and orphanage tourism and convict offenders. We welcome the government's commitment to promote women's rights and eliminate all forms of discrimination against women through a Good Men campaign and trainings to improve safety at work. We are concerned about the persisting cases of violence against women, including lack of investigations and prosecutions of those cases, as many victims choose informal mediation. We urge government to investigate all cases of domestic and gender-based violence. Montenegro recommends, first, to ratify the optional protocol to ICCPR aiming at the abolition of the death penalty, and second, to explicitly criminalize the recruitment and use of children under the age of 18
into armed conflicts and non-state armed groups. We wish to the distinguished delegation of Cambodia a successful outcome of this UPR cycle. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Myanmar.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation would like to welcome the delegation of Cambodia, led by the President of the Cambodian Human Rights Committee, and thank them for the presentation of the UPR report. We commend Cambodia for successful implementation of the recommendations. We are encouraged by significant developments in poverty reduction, promotion of gender equality and equity, education and healthcare. In the spirit of cooperation, we wish to recommend to pursue a health strategic plan 2060-2020 of the Ministry of Health of Cambodia in order to ensure that citizens obtain full-fledged healthcare services. Continue implementation of relevant laws to ensure that all citizens have access to free primary and secondary education at public schools, and that all citizens could receive schooling for at least 9 years. As a fellow member of ASEAN, we wish Cambodia every success in this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of Kingdom of Cambodia and commends the presentation of its comprehensive national report. We appreciate Cambodia for developing strategies for fulfilling the obligations of the core human rights conventions and its continued efforts in fulfilling the recommendations of the last UPR cycle. The steps Cambodia has taken towards promotion and protection of human rights are noteworthy. My delegation applauds Cambodia's success in reduction of poverty and uplift of the living standards of the people, which will have beneficial impacts on the realization of human rights. Cambodia has already set the grounds for graduation from LDC status, and in this respect we wish for all success in its vision to attain the higher middle income country status by 2030. We also note that Cambodia is focusing on future-oriented programs such as education for all in order to increase opportunities for all children and youth in an inclusive manner. While wishing Cambodia a successful UPR, my delegation makes following recommendations to the government of Cambodia for its consideration. 1. Continue efforts for establishment of the NHRI as per the Paris Principles. 2. Enhance efforts to eliminate all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination and ensure empowerment of all vulnerable groups.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Netherlands.
Kingdom of Cambodia for the presentation of its national report. The Netherlands commends Cambodia for its commitment to inclusive instruction on sexual orientation issues, sexual education and gender-based violence for grades 5 to 12. However, we are particularly concerned by the increasing and arbitrary restrictions on civil society organizations and the media. Therefore, the Netherlands recommends Cambodia, first, to ensure a free civic space allowing human rights defenders and journalists to freely express themselves both offline and online without fear of harassment or reprisal, and to refrain from prosecution for exercising their fundamental rights under the Criminal Code and the law on telecommunications. 2. To amend Article 45 of the Constitution so as to enable legal marriage equality with a view to pursuing full equal treatment of LGBTI persons in all areas. The Netherlands wishes Cambodia success with the follow-up of all recommendations it receives during this third UPR cycle. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. New Zealand welcomes recent steps taken by Cambodia to release some political prisoners in September 2018 and to partially relax the bans on 118 CNRP politicians. However, as we have discussed with Cambodia, New Zealand continues to have significant ongoing concerns about the political situation in Cambodia. We encourage further steps to restore democratic values and full respect for the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Specifically, New Zealand recommends the following: that Cambodia immediately and unconditionally release all remaining political prisoners and opponents and drop all charges against them, including the full release of opposition leader Kem Sokha. That the government of Cambodia fully implement the recommendations of the latest report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia, including the addendum from the OHCHR, and that Cambodia amend the law on political parties, the trade union law, and the law on association and non-governmental organizations, so as to bring them into line with Cambodia's international human rights obligations in consultation with affected stakeholders and civil society. We thank the delegation for their participation today. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Nicaragua. Nicaragua is absent. The next speaker is Norway. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Norway welcomes Cambodia's participation in the UPR mechanism. We remain concerned about democratic developments, including the recent elections and the treatment of human rights activists. Norway recommends that Cambodia 1. Restores democratic and political space, ensuring participation for political parties, civil society and independent media. 2. Immediately releases from custody any individual detained for their peaceful exercise of freedom of expression and assembly, and drop all criminal charges against these individuals. 3. Completes the process of judicial reform, safeguarding independence and impartiality of the court system, court personnel and judges in accordance with international standards. 4. Intensifies efforts to improve human rights for women and combat human trafficking, domestic violence and exploitation of women and children. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Pakistan warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia for presentation of its national report. We note with appreciation the significant efforts of Cambodia to eliminate discrimination against women and to promote gender equality and equity through development and implementation of various laws, policies, action plans and programs. My delegation recommends the government of Cambodia to 1. Continue its efforts to ensure provision of equitable education services to all children through both formal and informal education systems. 2. Take steps to promote access to free education and healthcare services, especially in rural areas. 3. Continue to implement gender equality policy to ensure gender mainstreaming in all sectors and programs. 4. Continue to take measures ensuring poverty eradication and access to health and education services. We wish Cambodia a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Philippines welcomes warmly the delegation of Cambodia, our fellow ASEAN member, to this UPR session. We acknowledge Cambodia's plans to localize the Sustainable Development Goals and believe that this is a positive step in the promotion of the socio-economic rights of those belonging to the vulnerable sectors to ensure inclusive development. We welcome Cambodia's initiative to institutionalize consultations with civil society organizations. As a member of the Platform for Human Rights Education and Training, the Philippines commends Cambodia's efforts to promote human rights awareness through education and training programs. In a constructive spirit, the Philippines presents the following recommendations. 1. Continue efforts to enhance the participation of persons with disabilities. 2. Further strengthen programs to address discrimination against women and girls and to promote gender equality. 3. Continue to effectively implement the law on suppression of trafficking in persons and sexual exploitation. And 4. Consider ratification of the International Convention on the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families. In closing, the Philippines sincerely wishes Cambodia all success on its third UPR. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Portugal.
Mr. Vice President, Portugal welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and the steps taken for the fulfillment of the right to health. We make the following recommendations. 1. Take all the adequate measures to protect children from sexual exploitation, in particular in the context of the orphanage tourism, including by strengthening its regulatory framework and awareness raising measures and by ensuring that all allegations are investigated, victims are redressed, and perpetrators are sanctioned. 2, adopt a public health and human rights approach to the whole drug problem, including the decriminalization of drug consumption and the provision of harm reduction service. 3, enforce the legal age for marriage to prohibit child marriage and promote awareness-raising campaigns to prevent child marriage. 4, protect the rights of peasants and other persons working in rural areas, including by ensuring that they are adequately compensated in case of resettlement. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
The Republic of Korea warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks for comprehensive presentation of its national report. Impressed by the recent economic growth of Cambodia and its impact on the poverty reduction, the Republic of Korea commends Cambodia for its efforts to realize SDGs. We are also encouraged by actions and measures to protect and promote the rights of women and children, laborers and persons with disabilities. Establishing the National Committee Against Torture in 2017, strengthening efforts to combat against human trafficking, and expanding budget for public health service are noteworthy as meaningful progress since the last UPR. As Cambodia is moving toward an upper middle income country, we believe Cambodia continues to strengthen its efforts to share the benefits of economic growth with more and more people and to prioritize the human rights in seeking the SDGs. Having said, the Republic of Korea offers the following 2 recommendations. First, continue to exert existing efforts to make democratic space more inclusive. 2, continue efforts to ensure universal and free basic education with inclusive measures, in particular for vulnerable groups. The Republic of Korea wishes Cambodia all the success during the next cycle and all the best in seeking the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Republic of Moldova.
The Republic of Moldova welcomes the delegation of Cambodia to the 32nd UPR Working Group meeting. We acknowledge Cambodia's effort to increase people's access to justice, in particular with initiatives such as the establishment of the National Committee Against Torture in accordance with the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. We welcome the measures to prevent gender-based violence against women and the improvement of women's access to the justice system, including by establishing the Department of Legal Protection for Women within the Ministry of Women's Affairs. The Republic of Moldova commends these efforts and encourages the government of Cambodia to implement additional measures to ensure effective access to justice for women. In this sense, we recommend the following. 1. Conduct comprehensive investigations of cases of domestic and sexual violence and ensure that perpetrators are prosecuted and victims are adequately compensated. 2. Provide mandatory trainings on the prosecution procedures of cases of gender-based violence for law enforcement and judicial officials. The Republic of Moldova wishes Cambodia success in its UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, we thank the delegation of Cambodia for the report presented. We note the efforts of the government to combat extreme poverty, to provide for sustainable development and improve access to health and education. We are well aware of the difficult context in which the government of Cambodia is called upon to resolve complex issues relating to capacity building in the area of human rights. We welcome the determination of Cambodia to find solutions by actively involving civil society organizations. This is the right approach, which is likely to accelerate the attainment of tangible results. It is clear that Cambodia must continue to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2030 Agenda. In this area, too, we recommend that efforts be stepped up to ensure the social and economic rights of the citizens of the country. We note the steps of the government to protect women and children from domestic violence. In this context, we would like to recommend to Cambodia that it reform the national legislation with a view to strengthening the protection of women and children against family violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Senegal.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Senegal would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Cambodia and thank it for the comprehensive presentation of its national report under the third UPR cycle. Senegal welcomes the efforts made by the Kingdom of Cambodia to strengthen the rule of law, in particular by providing for the independence of the judicial system as attested to by the holding of orderly and fair trials, upholding the rights and obligations of parties. Advances in fighting against child labor are also commendable and are in keeping with the commitments undertaken during the previous UPR. My delegation welcomes this progress and makes the following recommendations. 1. Complete the land reform to facilitate access, use and the development of land for individuals and small and medium-sized enterprises. Second, build up human and financial resources to ensure school enrollment for all at the primary and secondary levels. We wish the best of success to Cambodia in the implementation of the recommendations it will accept. Thank you.
I give the floor to Serbia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Serbia warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks for the presentation of the national report. We commend the efforts invested by the authorities of Cambodia related to the recommendations received during the previous UPR cycle. Serbia particularly commends the efforts invested in improving the situation of women and children. We wish to recommend the following: to continue with measures that extend the domain of social and health care, and to continue investing efforts to combat poverty by applying measures that would make the country's evident economic development reflect on all strata of society. We wish Cambodia a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Singapore.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We commend the Cambodian government for significantly reducing poverty rates by close to 40% and for graduating from a low-income country to a low-middle-income country during the review period. This was accomplished through the effective implementation of rural development programs and providing support for small and medium enterprises, among other measures. We also commend the Cambodian government's efforts for improving access to healthcare services and their public health outcomes, including the significant decline in child mortality rates and the decline in HIV prevalence in the adult general population. We recommend that the Cambodian government continues to invest in improving its public health infrastructure, in particular in the rural areas, to ensure the effective implementation of its Health Strategic Plan 2016 to 2020. We recognize the improvements in Cambodia's public schools at all levels during the period under review, as it seeks to ensure all citizens receive at least 9 years of education. We recommend that the government invest in the training of teachers to ensure their skills and knowledge remain current to enhance the quality of their instruction. As a fellow ASEAN member, Singapore wishes Cambodia every success in achieving its development goals and improving the well-being and livelihood of its people. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Slovenia.
Mr. Vice President, Slovenia welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We wish to recommend to Cambodia to 1. Protect from harassment, arbitrary arrests and physical attacks against journalists, human rights defenders, members of political opposition, trade union workers, and to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators of such attacks. 2. Protect NGOs and associations and to ensure that the administrative provisions of the law on associations and NGOs will not be used to close down, suspend, or otherwise negatively impact NGOs and associations. While we welcome steps taken by the government to eliminate discrimination against women and to promote gender equality, we know that violence against women and gender-based violence remain to be a problem. We encourage the government to take appropriate measures to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators of such violence. We welcome the establishment of the Cambodian Human Rights Committee as an institution to provide education and training on international human rights law at all levels, including civil servants and armed forces. Finally, we are concerned about the reports of harassment and intimidation of journalists, human rights defenders, trade union workers, and other civil society actors. We also remain concerned about the law on associations and NGOs and its implications for the work of NGOs.
Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Spain.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Spain wishes a warm welcome to the Cambodian delegation and thanks it for participating in this exercise. Spain recommends, 1, that they continue to implement recommendations accepted under the 2014 UPR, in particular the establishment of an NHRI for the promotion and protection of human rights, which is equipped with sufficient resources. Secondly, that they legally prohibit the child sex trade in the context of the new National Action Plan for the elimination of illegal trafficking and smuggling in human beings, exploitation of workers and sexual exploitation. Thirdly, that they reform the criminal code to ensure that freedom of expression, assembly and association are guaranteed in addition to the protection of human rights defenders, and to ensure that these last can go about their work without fear of intimidation. We would like to express our concern regarding the situation of stateless persons. As a result, we recommend, fourthly, that they adopt all necessary measures to ensure that all those born in Cambodia might acquire Cambodian nationality and that they have access to identity papers. Finally, we recommend, fifthly, that they implement necessary legal coverage in the sphere of the protection of those with disabilities, particularly in order to protect their socio-educational and health requirements, particularly the most essential ones. Thank you very much.
I give the floor to Sweden.
Mr. Vice President, Sweden welcomes Cambodia's participation in the UPR process and acknowledges steps towards the strengthening of LGBTI persons' full enjoyment of human rights. However, Sweden still remains deeply concerned by the negative developments in Cambodia, not least with regard to political rights, including participation in political processes and freedom of expression and association, peaceful assembly and freedom of opinion. The use of the judiciary to restrict human rights also affect a range of other human rights and have contributed to a climate of fear, intimidation and self-censorship, including on the internet. Sweden would therefore like to make the following recommendations. 1. To revise recent enactments and revisions of legislation that violate the rights to freedom of expression and association, including the vague and broad grounds for preventing publication on the internet. In the proclamation on publication, controls of websites and social media. 2. To ensure that the trade union rights of workers are guaranteed in line with ILO Convention #87 and that unions may register unhindered and represent their members. 3. To introduce new legislation that guarantees equality and explicitly prohibits discrimination of LGBTI persons. Sweden wishes Cambodia all success in the current review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Mr. Vice President, Switzerland would like to extend a welcome to the delegation of Cambodia. We are deeply concerned at the deterioration of civil and political rights as exemplified by the restrictions to the freedom of expression and civil society, as well as the enforced dissolution of the main opposition party before the 2018 elections. Switzerland recommends that Cambodia ensure that all citizens may fully enjoy their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly and association. Switzerland welcomes the recent institutional dialogue established between the Ministry of the Interior and civil society and encourages that the challenges the latter is facing be resolved. Switzerland recommends that Cambodia amend the law on telecommunications and adopt the law on access to information in line with international standards of the right to the freedom of expression and the right to privacy. Switzerland welcomes the work of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. We recommend that Cambodia implement a mechanism for reparations for the victims of genocide. Switzerland regrets that the concession of land to legal and moral entities, as well as the economic land concessions, lead to enforced evictions. We recommend that Cambodia guarantee that the victims of this land grab be fairly heard and, if necessary, receive fair compensation and a non-discriminatory access to justice.
Give the floor to Thailand.
President, Thailand welcomes His Excellency Mr. Remy Keo, President of the Cambodian Human Rights Committee and the Cambodian Delegation to the 3rd UPR cycle. We commend Cambodia for the continued efforts on poverty reduction and development in all dimensions, which resulted in its economic status raised to the lower middle income country in 2015. We believe that the implementation of the rectangular strategy for growth, employment, equity and efficiency, Phase 4, will bring about sustainable development and help the country attain its goal of achieving upper middle income status within 2030. We are applauding Cambodia's efforts in maintaining its GDP annual growth rate at 7%, which contributes to the country's development. We recommend Cambodia to take further measures to narrow the development gap, as well as improve access to education and healthcare services, especially for people in rural areas, to ensure that no one is left behind. To further enhance the promotion and protection of human rights in the country, Thailand recommends Cambodia to expedite the process of finalizing the law on the establishment of the National Human Rights Institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. As a close neighbour and fellow ASEAN member, Thailand stands ready to share our experiences and support Cambodia in achieving its goals, including through our development cooperation. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to Togo.
Vice-Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Togo wishes to warmly welcome the delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. Togo welcomes the remarkable progress achieved by Cambodia in implementing the recommendations it accepted during the last UPR so as to advance human rights in the country. My delegation notes with satisfaction that there has been an improvement in economic and social rights, in particular the right to health, to social protection, as well as an increase in the minimum wage, thanks to the current robust economic growth. Moreover, my country encourages the royal government to attach a greater priority to investments in human rights, and we would like to make the following recommendations. First, accelerate the drafting of a law to establish a National Human Rights Institute in line with the Paris Principles. Secondly, step up efforts to fight discrimination against ethnic and racial minorities and develop a national plan of action against racial discrimination. Third, reinforce the judicial mechanisms to fight sexual and family violence and human trafficking and carry out a program for awareness raising and education on these issues. Fourth, take measures to simplify the allocation of community land concessions to the indigenous peoples. We wish the Kingdom of Cambodia the best of success in the implementation of the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to welcome the delegation of Cambodia and thank it for the presentation of its national report and the information it included. We welcome the legislations adopted since the last UPR, which aim to support the human rights legislative and institutional framework, particularly through setting up the national mechanism against torture, as well as developing national strategies to protect people with disability and supporting children in street situations and helpless children. We would like to make the following recommendations. First, maintain ongoing efforts to set up a national human rights mechanism in line with Paris Principles. Second, keep up efforts to ensure right to inclusive, free and mandatory primary education. Third, pursue efforts to combat trafficking in persons. In closing, we wish Cambodia success in this UPR. And thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to Turkey.
President, we welcome the distinguished delegation of Cambodia and thank them for the comprehensive national report they have submitted and for their informative presentation. We commend the Cambodian authorities for their constructive engagement with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia. We recognize that Cambodia is in a significant phase of development with strong economic growth and remarkable progress in poverty reduction. We are glad to observe that Cambodia has taken important steps towards reaching the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In this context, we recommend the government of Cambodia to continue its considerable efforts to promote and protect human rights through concrete commitment for good governance, transparency, public participation in the decision-making process and access to justice. In this regard, we welcome specifically the new instruction issued by the Ministry of Interior, which allows the NGOs to conduct their activities in accordance with Cambodian laws with full freedom, forming of the new Supreme Consultative Council established by the Royal Decree, which was created to mitigate the absence of an elected opposition in the National Assembly, and the latest amendment on the law on political parties that will create an appeal mechanism for the politicians who were banned from politics to return to their political activities. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ukraine thanks the delegation of Cambodia for its national report. We note certain progress since the second UPR cycle and acknowledge Cambodia's strong record of ratification of core human rights instruments. However, Ukraine is concerned with credible reports pointing to a shrinking civic space in Cambodia, including adoption of legislation that restricts civil and political rights. We regret that these challenges are aggravated by reported undermining of the country's judiciary. We believe that enhancing cooperation with UN special procedures and establishment of a fully functioning national human rights institution would contribute to addressing them. Thus, we recommend to comply with obligations under ICCPR in elaboration, implementation and revision of policy and legislation, to ensure accountability for human rights violations through independent investigations and prosecution of perpetrators, to finalize in an expedited manner the procedures related to establishment of a national human rights institution in line with the Paris principles, to issue standing invitation to all UN special procedures, to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR on abolition of the death penalty. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The UK welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and appreciates its participation in the UPR. The UK is concerned by the human rights situation in Cambodia, particularly the shrinking of democratic space through the dissolution of the CNRP, the imprisonment of Kem Sokha, and the national election in July 2018, which lacked legitimacy. We note that Cambodia has amended Article 45 of the Law of Political Parties and removed the required 3 days notification of NGOs' activities to the local authority. However, we urge that all charges against Kem Sokha be dropped. We have 3 recommendations. 1. Reverse the forced closure of media outlets, repeal provisions of the criminal code that criminalise defamation and restrict freedom of expression and assembly, and remove without conditions the ban on the 118 former CNRP members from engaging in political activities. 2. Improve and expand identification and protection procedures for victims of human trafficking, forced labour and bonded labour, and ensure adequate access to support services and sheltered accommodation. And 3. Implement a coherent resettlement policy and simplified process for granting communal land titles, consulting communities, civil society and indigenous groups. The UK recognises Cambodia's commitment to ending human trafficking and bonded labour. We encourage Cambodia to accept a visit from the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you. The United States welcomes the Cambodian delegation. We recommend that Cambodia, 1, immediately and unconditionally reinstate the rights of members of the political opposition and release all persons who have been arbitrarily detained, including Kem Sokha. 2, immediately remove all undue restrictions on civil society and independent media, including withdrawing the interministerial decision known as Prakas 170 on digital expression. 3, as previously committed to by the government following Cambodia's second UPR review, simplify and reform registration procedures for unions and other civil society organizations. We remain gravely concerned about the serious decline in the respect for civil and political rights in Cambodia. The government's suppression of the political opposition, independent media, and civil society, and undue restrictions on workers' rights to freedom of association and peaceful assembly resulted in July 29 parliamentary elections that were neither genuinely free nor fair. Collectively, these developments substantially eroded Cambodia's prior achievements in promoting political reconciliation and economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Uruguay.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Uruguay welcomes the Cambodian delegation and commends Cambodia for the measures adopted following the last UPR aimed at reducing child labour and eliminating the worst forms of child labour, as well as the campaigns aimed at eliminating violence against women and girls, as demonstrated by the national report. In that regard, we look forward to seeing a continuation of the taking into account of our previous recommendation concerning the adoption of measures to prevent violence and sexual abuse, including rape, the promotion of effective mechanisms to receive and investigate complaints, and the provision of medical and psychological care for victims. We'd like to urge Cambodia to continue to work and, in so doing, to make the following recommendations: to redouble its efforts to eliminate discrimination against women in the legal sphere and ensure that discriminating stereotypes and damaging practices to which Cambodian women are subject are combated. Secondly, that they amend their national legislation in order to ensure that it's in line with the CRC and particular attention is placed on their criminal code and the juvenile justice system in so doing. Finally, spurred on by the principle of equality and non-discrimination, Uruguay recommends that effective measures are adopted to combat and punish discrimination and violence motivated by sexual orientation and gender identity. Thank you very much. We wish you all the best in your review.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Thank you very much, President. We welcome the illustrious delegation of Cambodia and appreciate its efforts to comply with the recommendations accepted under the UPR. The country has shown sustained annual economic growth of 7% in recent decades, and the poverty rate dropped from 53.2% in 2004 to 13.5% in 2015. The social security system has been strengthened to support vulnerable groups, including access to drinking water. The 2016-2020 Strategic Health Plan is among its target SDGs, and health centres increased from 96 in 2008 to 1,190 in 2017, and hospitals went from 84 in 2008 to 117 currently. The government is making concerted efforts to combat trafficking in persons, particularly women and children. In 2008, the law to eliminate trafficking in persons and sexual exploitation was approved, and the National Committee to Combat Trafficking in Persons was established. Cambodia has established universal coverage of primary education. Progress is underway in establishing an NHRI in line with the Paris Principles. We congratulate Cambodia and recommend that they continue to strengthen their apposite policies aimed at supporting its citizens, particularly the most vulnerable, and that they continue to step up activities aimed at combating trafficking in persons, in particular women and children, and they strengthen measures to detect, prevent and punish this crime. We wish them every success in their UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Keo Remy and his delegation to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I will respond to each question and comment in group categorized by issue. Related to national mechanism to coordinate the implementation of accepted UPR recommendation. Cambodian Human Rights Committee (CHRC) is a central agent of the government established to coordinate with other line ministry and other relevant stakeholders to compile the human rights report to be submitted to each UN treaty body and monitor to implementation of recommendations received from those treaty bodies. Other special procedure as well as UPR at those line ministry under initiative and supervision of the CHR, and for a better coordination in report writing tasks of monitoring mission on human rights implementation at other line ministry, the government issued a sub-decree on December 18, 2017, established an inter-ministerial working group which consists of all relevant governmental agencies with two levels, in decision-making process, political and technical level. In practice, CHRC is in charge of writing 5 main UN reports and monitoring implementation of those 5 main reports by other line ministry as following. UPR report, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights report, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights report, International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination report, International Convention for Protection of All Persons from Enforced Discipline report. In addition to this, the government also established other central mechanism, right? Some other UN-specific report to be submitted to the UN treaty body and mechanism to monitor implementation of those reports as following. International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women report by a Cambodian National Council for Women, Ministry of Women Affairs. International Convention on the Right of the Child report by Cambodian National Council for Children, Ministry of Social Affairs, Veteran and Youth Rehabilitation. International Convention on the Right of Persons with Disability report by Disability Action Council, Ministry of Social Affairs, Veteran and Youth Rehabilitation. International Convention Against Torture, other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment report by National Committee Against Torture, other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, Ministry of Interior. United Nations Convention Against Corruption report by Anti-Corruption Unit. Related to draft law on access information, the Royal Government has officially permitted to establish the law on access to information. Ministry of Information has led and collaborated with the Swedish Embassy and UNESCO in Cambodia through the establishment of a joint technical working group consisting of state institutions, UN agency in Cambodia, CSO, professional, media, experts, academia, researcher, and development partner to draft the law on access to information. Currently, the draft law has been completed at a technical working group level, and it has been proceeded further to ensure legality and completeness in compliance with international standards and economic social situation of the Kingdom of Cambodia. And the next step is discussion at inter-ministerial meeting. This is a good model of legislative drafting process that involves all the stakeholders for consultation and implementation in the future. The government is committed to complete the draft law on right to access to information together with other two important laws, cybercrime law and amendment of law on press regime, at the same time to ensure the consistency and legal harmonization in this sixth mandate of Parliament. Related to sexual orientation, sexuality, education and gender-based violence, the Royal Government has made significant effort to eliminate discrimination against women and to promote gender equality and equity in Cambodia through the development and implementation of legal framework, policy action plan, and education program to address and respond to discrimination, violence against women and girls, to promote equality between men and women in the society. According to Rectangular Strategy Phase 4, the government has clear plan to promote gender equality, sexual orientation, sexuality education, to eliminate discrimination, gender-based violence as following. Mainstreaming gender equity in policy framework and national development plan, reducing gender gap in education, vocational training and the civil service, widening women entrepreneurship initiative, reducing domestic violence and sexual abuse against women and children, uplifting social morality, women dignity and Cambodian family, improving legal services for women and children, put in place and implemented the social protection policy framework 2016 to 2025. LGBT, related to LGBT, even though there is a lack of policy and legal framework governing the right of LGBT people, the government has been taking some action eliminating discrimination against LGBT community in Cambodia through promoting the public awareness on this issue and the dissemination program via media, formal and informal education. Regard with legal awareness, the civil law of Cambodia not yet recognize the legitimacy of homosexual marriage and registration. However, the law not either criminalize such marriage and practice like some other countries. Such homosexual marriage is okay and very common in Cambodia society through traditional and cultural practices, as it's found that approximately 1,000 the same-sex couples have already been married with traditional party and ceremony. In reality, the LGBT people in Cambodia are exercising their right and freedom without restriction from the government and doing a lot of advocacy campaign locally and internationally to promote their right and freedom with full support and participation from government, particularly CHRC and Prime Minister also assure and send a message to the LGBT community through CHRC President, that's me, that the government must take the lead in promoting the LGBT right and eliminating all forms of discrimination against this community in Cambodia. However, to amend the civil law in order to legalize such practice, there needs to be more advocacy and promotion of public awareness so that it is more acceptable from society and community. The cultural resistance become less. As a result, the law will then be amended accordingly. Related to accession and ratification of other international human rights treaty and convention, Cambodia does much value human rights and democracy. Obviously, this country ratified 8 out of 9 core international human rights instruments, making it one of the prominent countries in terms of being party to human rights treaty. The royal government of Cambodia has also been studying legal factor, national economic factor, and other relevant factors to determine appropriate time and condition, which will ensure that the Kingdom of Cambodia deserves ratification or accession of other international treaties such as the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and the members of their family, the UNESCO Convention on the Prevention of Discrimination in Education, the 2 optional protocols, 2 Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the optional protocol to Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, Article 14 of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the optional protocol to Convention on the Right of Persons with Disability, and other important international legal instruments. Arrest Kamsaka and dissolution of CNRP. National reconciliation is subject to genuine commitment from all parties concerned to put national interests at the top without receiving order from foreign power. For the case of Mr. Kamsaka, the government has clear evidences to prove that he was involved in a treason case with support from foreign power to topple legitimate government through undemocratic means. Such illegal act is not subject to discussion on promotion of democracy when it itself is naturally a subversion of democracy. The current Cambodian legitimate action against individual, Mr. Kamsaka, and institutions who committed treason and conspiracy is the only legitimate way to protect our peace and democracy under the rule of law. In fact, the act of treason, espionage, and conspiracy with the foreign power that advocate the overthrow of the legitimate government is subject to severe punishment under every country law, and Cambodia is no exception. However, it is very regretful to see that its only legitimate action by sovereign states have been politicized under the banner of human rights and democracy due to geopolitical interests of other states. Based on overwhelming evidence, including Kamsaka video footage and several statements of members of the CNRP Standing Committee affirming a systematic manner of cooperation between CNRP and organization and convict person sovereignty and foreign government to overthrow the legitimate government in Phnom Penh, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the CNRP, an organization, conspired with the foreign power to overthrow legitimate government in Cambodia by way of color revolution. Such as an act is an illegal act against the Kingdom of Cambodia, harming the national security and a threat to the peace of country, in clear violation of the point 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8 of Article 6 new 2 and Article 7 of the Law Political Party. The decision of the Supreme Court was made by a panel of 9 judges at the public hearing held in accordance with the court procedure of the Kingdom of Cambodia, whereby all the relevant parties were afforded to opportunity present the defense by appointing their own representative or legal defense team. Following the Supreme Court summons, the CNRP have chosen not to file defense petition, nor have they appointed a representative or lawyer to attend the court proceeding, which is tantamount to an abandonment of their legal right to defend themselves before the court. We wish to highlight that such court practices do not differ from those of other countries, whether they belong to the common law or civil law system. By refusing to participate in the court proceeding, the CNRP not only abandoned its right to legal defense, but also acquiesced to a guilty plea in absentia for its violation of the various provisions of the law political party. Legal action against political party violating the law is the normal process in democratic state to constitute the enforcement of principle of the rule of law, to strengthen the process of democracy and to guarantee peace stability, which serve as a basis for long-term sustainable socio-economic development. However, under the spirit of the national unity, the two parliamentarian members and other 14 offenders who are the members of former opposition party has been released on the amnesty request from the Prime Minister, and Mr. Kamsaka has been released on bail under judicial supervision and wait for further court procedure. While there is a lack of opposition party in the parliament due to result democratic election held in July last year, and in order to further promote democracy and the rule of law in Cambodia, the royal government has set up participatory consultative mechanism with all political parties in Cambodia known as Supreme Consultative Council to collect multifaceted input for the benefit of national construction. This council replaced the existence of opposition in parliament as it creates a public consultative forum within the process of legal and policy formulation and implementation, and also check and balance platform with government through their monitoring mechanism, criticism, comments and recommendations provided to the government to be addressed. Media and freedom and expression related. It is commonly reported that freedom of expression in Cambodia is under threat. However, it is a matter of misperception. Currently, Cambodia has some 800 printer media organizations, 70 online publications, 22 TV stations, 330 radio stations, 38 journalist associations. The royal government is dedicated to increase the use of internet all over the country, and today some 50% of total population can access and use it. Therefore, if the government wants to limit freedom of expression, then government would not have any incentive to increase the best channel for sharing freely information and opinion. According to the Reporter Without Borders in 2016, World Press Freedom Index, Cambodia ranked first among the 10 Asian countries. Freedom of expression does not mean freedom to insult, to fake information, to defame someone. Right to expression of opinion is not right to lie and discredit someone. All Western countries have law punishing such practices. Statements promoting hate, xenophobia are also prohibited in Europe. The case of Cambodia Daily, a new bulletin catered to the expatriate community, is a case of a self-initiated closure due to tax non-compliant issue. If the back tax are settled, the new bulletin can resume its operation. For the record, two other widely circulated online and printed Khmer and English version newspaper, Khmer Time and Phnom Penh Post, remain operational and thriving. In case of Radio Free Asia and VOA, the broadcast from Washington, D.C. can be heard uninterrupted daily throughout the country along with the online webcast. It is also worth noting that with the high internet penetration and increased usage of smartphone, listening to traditional radio waves have become obsolete for most young people who occupy Cambodia's demographic majority. Then, that notwithstanding, the Ministry of Information encourages that both stations set up properly their representative office in Cambodia to facilitate direct communication, especially when quick responses are needed to counter fake news. Local radio stations wishing to rebroadcast their news are subject to normal licensing requirement of the Ministry of Information. In the case of Inter-Ministerial Prakas number 170 in May 2018 on Internet website management, it was issued not to restrict individual right to freedom of expression on Internet, but to protect the use of Internet on purpose for committed offense that lead to damaging national security, social order, and interests of the people. Royal Government is strongly committed to promote genuine dialogue, participation, and partnership with local, internationally civil society organizations, CSO, media, and union, all aspects of social development. In this spirit, to promote cooperation with media, Prime Minister also set up a regular meeting and gathering with the media organization in Cambodia once a year to strengthen cooperation between government and media and the partnership and participation with government in fighting against corruption and developing every aspect of society through their professionalism to providing and releasing information to the government and society. The meeting has been conducted 3 times already, and the 3rd meeting was just held on January 11, 2019. Moreover, in order to promote and protect the right to information, the government is also working further on policy and legal framework and committed to complete the draft law on right to access information together with other 2 important laws, cyber crime law and amendment of law on press regime, at the same time to ensure the consistent legal harmonization in this mandate in Parliament. Related to strengthening civil society space, Cambodia is paradise for NGO. You can imagine that the population of Cambodian only 15 million people, but Cambodia is a home to almost 6,000 registered local and international associations and NGO and over 4,000 trade unions, an overwhelming figure as compared a country in the region. After the language came into effect and at the end of November 2018, 509 local associations and 400 local NGO have been registered at the Ministry of Interior. We believe that such a high number of CSO is a clear and convincing evidence of the open space for civil society in Cambodia. Unfortunately, a number of them hiding behind the veil of supposedly humanitarian and development activity are in fact deeply engaged in political activity funded by foreign institutions and government. Cambodia appreciates genuine and honest contribution of social, environmental, and human rights workers to development of Cambodia. However, no one is above the law, and offender will be subject to the full force of the law. Moreover, we deplore those who use to exploit the right agenda for political purpose. Cambodia wishes to refer to several positive points raised by the UN Special Rapporteur Professor Rona Smith in her end of mission statement, dated 8 November 2018. She welcomed the recent creation of the government working group under the leadership of the Ministry of Interior to consult regularly with civil society. A preparatory meeting was held on 7 December 2018, and the second forum on partnership between the government and CSO was held on 17 January 2019. The fora were attended by hundreds of CSO without discrimination, and constructive discussion has resulted in various tangible action in facilitating activity of the CSO. Parallelly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in cooperation, organized consultative forum with foreign and international NGO on 29 January 2019. Such fora, inclusive and collaborative in spirit, will aim to enhance better understanding on various issues surrounding with implementation of language and other law related to the CSO. Professor Rona Smith also welcomed the new directive number 0440, date 31 October 2018, issued by Ministry of Interior to subnational authority on 31st October 2018, repealing the 3-day advance notice requirement. Professor Ronald Smith also acknowledged the royal pardon of several convicted prisoners, analysts, land activists, and journalists as proposed by Samdech Prime Minister Hun Sen. As the December 2018, 23 convicts were released, including Kem Sok, on charges of incitement and defamation for insinuating that the ruling party was behind the killing of analyst Kam Lai, Tebani, and 3 other activists, on assaulting 2 security officers during the 2013 protests at Hun Sen home. 2 former Radio Free Asia reporters, Sun Sarai Ratha, president of the Khmer Power Party, on charges with inciting military personnel disobedience. Sam An on charge of Facebook posting improperly demarcated map, Ms. Savanara and other 13 ex-CNRP officials on charge for participating in violent clash between party supporters. Relating to land issue, although the land management system in Cambodia has been completely destroyed by war and genocidal regime, the royal government has introduced policy and legal framework to manage the land sector so as to ensure the right and interests of the people and proper land use. From both legal and actually practices perspective, land registration in Cambodia in an all-inclusive and non-discriminatory process, which includes through the public notice, the participation of relevant stakeholders to assert their respective rights and other concerns. Land registration applies to both urban and rural areas, including private land, state land, indigenous people community land, based on the Land Law 2001. The royal government has implemented its old policy by new action via Directive 01 dated May 07, 2012 on measures for strengthening and increasing effectiveness of economic land management by carving out 1.2 million hectares of state land to redistribute gratis to approximately 500,000 households, delivering in the process more than 640,000 land titles. In the principal, land registration and title issuance is possible provided that the land parcel in question is undisputed. Up to now, the royal government can proudly claim credit for the countrywide land registration process, which have delivered more than 4.7 million land titles. Its ambition and target is to complete a nationwide land registration by 2023. The royal government has imposed a moratorium in issuing economic land concession since May 2012, and existing economic land concession granted earlier are under strict monitoring and evaluation. Related to the right to education, with full peace and development in the educational sector in Cambodia has been growing from time to time, and the right to education. Cambodian people have been better to promote and protect through the establishment policy, legal framework, infrastructure development in the education sector. In infrastructure development, more schools have been constructed and moved closer to our people in local community by having one secondary school in one commune and one high school in one district. The development in education sector has provided a lot of favorable conditions to our Cambodian female to achieve the complete general education. As a result, more than 50% of female in Cambodia has complete general education, and public education institutions with secondary and high school level increased up to 1,731 schools, with 486 high school and 1,245 secondary schools throughout the whole country, with the total number to 279,480 students, in which 53.33% are female. For higher education level, the number of universities now increased up to 121, in which 48 schools are public, 73 schools are private throughout the whole country, with the total number of 219,069 students, in which 43.69 are female. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will now continue with our interactive dialogue. The next speaker is Vietnam. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Vietnam warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks it for the presentation of the national report. We welcome the continued commitment and efforts by Cambodia in protecting and promoting human rights, especially the rights of vulnerable groups. We commend the various achievements of Cambodia in recent years, including poverty reduction, gender equality, universal primary education, access to health care services. Vietnam would like to put forward the following recommendations. 1. Take further measures to sustain and reinforce progress made in poverty reduction. 2. Continue efforts to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all. Vietnam wishes Cambodia a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Yemen.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the President and members of the Cambodian delegation, and we thank them for their exhaustive and valuable presentation in which they have detailed the achievements of the government in the field of human rights. The government has indeed enacted several human rights laws, including the law organizing the courts and the special law on the status of judges and prosecutors, and the law organizing the Supreme Judicial Council. This besides what has been achieved in the field of public services, development and poverty reduction. My delegation supports the efforts undertaken by the government of Cambodia and recommends it to pursue its effort to finalize the law on the National Human Rights Commission and to activate the role of that commission. Finally, we wish Cambodia a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Algeria.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to warmly welcome the delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia and thank it for the presentation of the third report. Algeria has read this report with great interest and notes with satisfaction the implementation of a national mechanism to fight torture established by the Royal Government of Cambodia, as well as the adoption of a series of laws to protect the rights of persons with disabilities and to protect children against degrading treatment, forced labor and sexual violence. My country encourages the Royal Government of Cambodia to pursue its reform of the legal and judicial systems by developing a robust legal framework which is regarded as more trustworthy by the population and which rests upon the independence and impartiality of the courts. We make the following recommendations. 1. Accelerate the establishment of a national human rights institutions in line with the Paris Principles. 2. Intensify and coordinate the efforts of the Royal Government to combat human trafficking and prosecute traffickers. In conclusion, my delegation wishes the best of success to Cambodia in its efforts to implement the recommendations addressed to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Argentina.
Thank you very much, Vice President. We welcome the Cambodian delegation and thank them for the presentation of their national report. Argentina commends Cambodia for establishing the National Committee to Combat Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment as its national torture prevention mechanism. Further, our country recommends that Cambodia, 1. Adopt all necessary measures to ensure a safe environment, to guarantee the full enjoyment of freedom of expression of journalists and the general population, and investigates and punishes all acts of violence against these last. And secondly, that they adopt all necessary measures to guarantee the rights of workers to protect and promote human rights, and in particular human rights defenders, and that they investigate and punish those responsible for threats and violence against these and their families. Finally, we wish every success to Cambodia for this review. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia warmly welcomes the Cambodian delegation. Australia remains concerned about the constrained democratic space and restrictions on freedom of peaceful assembly and of association in Cambodia. We recommend Cambodia repeal the 2 sets of amendments to the law on political parties passed in 2017, review the law on associations and non-governmental organisations, and review the trade union law to ensure all 3 laws are consistent with Cambodia's obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Australia recommends the Government of Cambodia establish an independent national human rights institution consistent with the Paris Principles. Australia welcomes Cambodia's National Action Plan to prevent violence against women. Australia recommends that Cambodia allocate sufficient human and financial resources to establish at least 5 one-stop service centres by 2024 to provide support services free of charge to victims of gender-based violence. Finally, Australia recommends Cambodia introduce, by the end of 2023, an anti-discrimination law which guarantees equality and explicitly prohibits discrimination of all kinds, including on the basis of religion, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Austria.
Vice President, Austria welcomes His Excellency Mr. Keo Remy and the delegation of Cambodia and thanks them for their report and presentation today. Austria is seriously concerned about the deteriorating situation with regard to the rule of law in the country and therefore recommends to revise or repeal recent legal acts, potentially subject to restrictive and arbitrary interpretation, in order to bring them in conformity with international human rights law and standards, including, among others, the law on political parties and the election laws, the law on associations and non-governmental organizations, and the interministerial proclamation of May 2018 on social media. We also remain concerned about the impartiality of the Cambodian judiciary and therefore recommend to strengthen the independence and functioning of the judiciary, in particular by repealing or significantly amending the law on the organization of the courts, the law on the statute of judges and prosecutors, and the law on the organization and the functioning of the Supreme Court of the Magistracy. We also recommend to take all necessary steps towards a substantive reduction of the time spent by persons in pre-trial detention. Recognizing Cambodia's efforts to resolve outstanding claims in the land sector, we recommend to ensure that all pending land disputes, evictions and relocations are settled in a fair, transparent, negotiated and adequately compensated manner in accordance with...
Thank you. Time is up. Thank you. I give the floor to Azerbaijan.
President. Azerbaijan warmly welcomes the delegation of the Kingdom of Cambodia and thanks the delegation for the presentation of its national report today. We note with appreciation that the Royal Government of Cambodia has taken measures to implement the recommendation put forward by the delegation of Azerbaijan during the previous cycle of the UPR and has continued to increase national budget allocation to health sector. We commend that the number of healthcare centers, hospitals, as well as civil servants in the public health sector has increased in recent years. We also welcome the adoption of the Health Strategic Plan 2016-2020. While applauding Cambodia for the early achievement of the related Millennium Development Goals, we would like to recommend Cambodia to continue its efforts to meet Goal 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. We commend that economic growth had continued at high levels in Cambodia and poverty had continued to decline. In this regard, we positively note that Cambodia has been strengthening and expanding good cooperation with partners for effective implementation of programs aimed at rural development and poverty reduction. We recommend Cambodia to further continue these measures. In conclusion, we wish Cambodia a very successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium.
Belgium welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and wishes it every success in the exercise of its third UPR. We are pleased with the good cooperation between Cambodia and the Special Rapporteur, Mrs. Rona Smith. However, my country is concerned about Cambodia's shrinking space for civil society and the lack of judicial independence. Belgium therefore recommends the government of Cambodia to amend the law on trade unions in consultation with workers, labor advocates and other stakeholders to bring it in full compliance with ILO Conventions 87 and 98. 2. To ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And 3. To amend the laws on the organization of the courts, the statute of judges and prosecutors, and the organization and functioning of the Supreme Council of the Magistracy to guarantee and protect the independence of the judiciary. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to Penin.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to welcome the delegation of Cambodia and congratulate it on the presentation of its national report. While we welcome the progress achieved by the country in promoting and protecting human rights since the last UPR cycle, in particular by the ratification of several international legal instruments, we would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Accede to the Convention relating to the status of stateless persons of 1954 and to the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. 2. Accede to the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on individual communications. And to conclude, my delegation wishes Cambodia the best of success for this UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Bhutan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bhutan warmly welcomes the delegation of Cambodia and thanks them for the progress made in implementing their recommendations from the last cycle. We note with appreciation the judicial reforms undertaken by Cambodia, particularly the adoption of 3 core laws on the organization of the court, status of judges and prosecutors, and the organization and functioning of the Supreme Council of the Magistracy. We also note the measures taken to educate and train people, including the civil servants and law enforcement agencies, for disseminating information on human rights. We congratulate Cambodia for the considerable success it has achieved in economic growth and recommend that greater efforts be exerted to reduce poverty and realize the SDGs. We recommend that further steps be taken to fight corruption through strengthening accountability and institutional capacity. We also recommend Cambodia to continue with their efforts in the area of electoral reform. We wish Cambodia a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Halala, Mr. Vice President. The plurinational state of Bolivia wishes a warm welcome to the Cambodian delegation and thanks them for the information provided. We commend the determination to promote human rights in line with the commitment demonstrated by Cambodia when it ratified or acceded to 8 core human rights instruments. In a constructive vein, our delegation recommends 1. That Cambodia continue positive initiatives to facilitate the supply of drinking water, clean water to the poorest citizens, and secondly that they strengthen land use policies adopted in 2015 which established that gender equality and equality between men and women shall be ensured in the process of land registration. We wish the Cambodian delegation every success in the presentation of their report. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Brazil welcomes the delegation of Cambodia to the third cycle of the UPR. We respectfully present the following recommendations. 1. To consider repealing legislation that permits the dissolution of political parties and the ban of political leaders without due process. 2. To take measures to protect the freedom of expression, online and offline, as well as the freedom of association and assembly. By the same tenet, Brazil calls upon Cambodia to continue to investigate all cases of past human rights violations and to protect the full independence of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. We welcome the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Brazil expresses support to Cambodia's efforts to advance social protections for workers, expand social security coverage, provide access to basic education and improve health care. We take note of the recent document published by the government entitled Statement of the Royal Government of Cambodia on Further Steps to Strengthen Democracy and Political Space. And I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you, Vice President. Brunei would like to welcome the delegation of Cambodia to Geneva and express our appreciation for the updates provided since the country's last review. Brunei commends the various efforts undertaken by the Royal Government of Cambodia to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities by setting up a national strategic plan on disability with the goal to improve the living condition of persons with disabilities and their families and promoting equality before the law. Brunei also welcomes the progress of the National Action Plan 2016 to 2025 against child labor, which aims to reduce child labor and eliminate the worst forms of child labor. This includes the formation of the National Committee Against Child Labor and the reform of inspection mechanism. In this regard, we would like to propose two recommendations. 1. To continue to promote the rights of persons with disabilities through the government's National Strategic Plan, and 2. To continue strengthening laws and mechanisms that prohibit all forms of ill treatment of children and that protect them from forced labor, sexual exploitation and abuse. In conclusion, Brunei wishes Cambodia a successful conclusion to its third UPR session. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada would like to thank Cambodia for its presentation today and wishes it the best of success for this UPR. Canada nevertheless remains concerned by the restrictions imposed on civil society, the media and the political opposition. This trend was exacerbated by the undemocratic elections in 2018. Canada asks that Cambodia first strengthen democratic participation by guaranteeing the independence of the media, by establishing a safe and enabling environment for civil society and trade unions, and by fostering the full participation of opposition parties in the next regional, senatorial and legislative elections. Secondly, to re-establish the opposition parties, that is to say the Cambodia National Rescue Party, and to reinstate its members. Third, to adopt measures to prevent the unlawful eviction of Cambodians from their lands and to use mechanisms based on accountability and transparency to settle land disputes in an equitable and expeditious fashion as urged by Human Rights Council Resolution 36/32 adopted unanimously. Fourth, to amend Article 45 of the Constitution to allow homosexual couples to marry. Canada closely follows the implementation of recently announced reforms to expand the political space.
I thank you. The next speaker is Chile. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Vice President. We're grateful to the Cambodian delegation for the presentation of the national report. We recognize the efforts made by the authorities of this country to continue to work on the promotion and protection of human rights. In particular, we'd like to emphasize the establishment of the National Committee to Combat Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, as well as the huge progress represented by the reform to the legal system of this country. We respectfully recommend, 1, that they step up efforts to establish a national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles. Secondly, that they continue to work to bring about multi-party elections. Thirdly, that they adopt necessary measures to protect the rights of human rights defenders, unionists and journalists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the last speaker on our list. Please note that delivered statements will be posted on the UPR extranet, provided that they have been uploaded in the Word format in the same online system that delegations used for the inscriptions on the list of speakers. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Keo Remy and his delegation to address observations and comments and to make the final remarks. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Excellency Chin Malin, Vice President of the CHRC, also representative from the Ministry of Justice.
Mr. Vice President, as permitted by His Excellency Head of Cambodia Delegation, I would like now to respond to the comments and recommendations provided by the delegate, and also like to answer some the advanced question provided by the member state to us. And we are very much thankful to the member state who provided the advanced question to us. This is showing that you have a great interest and pay much attention to our human rights situation development in Cambodia. So first, related with the establishment of the National Human Rights Institution, I would like to update you a little bit about the current development and process. The Royal Government of Cambodia agreed in principle to establish a National Human Rights Institution through drafting the law on establishment of National Human Rights Institution in accordance with the Paris Principle. So far, Cambodian Human Rights Committee, CHRC, has cooperated with civil society organizations in the preparations of the draft law on establishment of the National Human Rights Institution. The draft law was initiated by civil society working group and was subjected to several discussions with Cambodian Human Rights Committee. However, the draft law has not been finalized yet. The CHRC will continue to work on the draft law with related stakeholders, especially with OHCHR office in Cambodia, in order to make this draft law comply with the Paris Principle and international standard. Second, related with the concerns of the report of killing journalists and the allegation that the journalists are threatened by harassment and intimidation, I would like to clarify and provide you the factual and legal ground as the following. For the record, no journalist has been killed for political reasons since 2000. We recognize that journalism is a high-risk profession. The Royal Government strongly condemns all attacks on the freedom of the press when acting in accordance with the law by media personnel, and we deplore any act of violence against journalists. Unfortunately, not all these incidents are politically motivated or related. Journalists' lack of understanding on news safety is also a cause of accident. Example, rushing to cover a drug bush without precaution, entering premise on fire without respecting safety instruction. Another cause of tragic accident is the result lack of moral code of ethics. There were many causes of death related to unethical personal business dealing, which are totally unrelated to their profession. A few anecdotal cases at point are some journalists, under the pretense of investigating journalism, set up illegal checkpoints to take bribes from illegal logger and goods smuggler, land dispute, and extortion on corrupted activity. There were 11 cases of such reported deaths from 1994 to 2012. Prosecutions were initiated for each case. The Royal Government regrets that the attacks against journalists are systematically attributed to the authority without any shred of evidence and based solely on the basis of rumors spread by ill-intentioned individuals or NGO, denouncing this assault using the tirelessly repeated formula as vilely politically motivated. The wholesale accusations address generally the effects of the assault, but rarely their cause. Freedom of press are guaranteed under the constitutions and regulated by the laws on the press regime. From here onward, press law. Journalists are provided full freedom to conduct in their work without harassment, discrimination, or threat. Moreover, in an attempt to further promote the freedom of expression, the royal government has even removed the clause related to defamation from the criminal codes and provide guarantee that no individual shall be imprisoned for expressing his or her opinion. As a broad and discriminate allegation of threat by harassment and intimidations against journalists, the royal government welcomes more specific and fact-based complaint to be forwarded to the competent authority. The royal government treats the media as an indispensable partner in the framework of pluralist democratic society. The royal government is keen to work in most constructive way with professional and responsible journalists to improve the good governance in every aspect of society, be they in anti-corruption campaign, legal, judiciary, and public administration reform. Third, related with election process in 2018 and the amendment of the law on political party, I would like to clarify as the following. Cambodia adheres to the multi-party democratic system. The evidence is more than obvious with numerous political parties during the last 5 general elections: 20 for 1993, 39 for 1998, 23 for 2003, 11 for 2008, 8 for 2013, and 20 for recent election in 2018. Cambodia undertook the amendment of law on political party based on principle laid in its constitution. From a legal perspective, the amended law applies indiscriminately to every political party and bear all these basic requirements that any democratic country should adhere to. Nothing in the amended law is threatening the fabric of multi-party system set up by the Constitution. As in all democratic countries, the amended law is aimed at preventing abuse that are not in accordance with fundamental democratic principles, such as incitation to racial hatred, defamation, destruction of a social fabric of the nation. It is inviolably duty of the government to protect the sanctities of its existing institution. What Cambodia did in terms of amending its own political party law is not at odds with international practice. For that matter, the European Union, through Venice Commission, has adopted in 1999 its guideline on prohibition and dissolution of political party, an analogous measure. The prohibition or dissolution of political party can be envisaged, if necessary, to protect democratic society when, for example, a party advocates violence in all forms such as racism, xenophobia, and intolerance. We see the same practice and stipulation in some countries in Europe, such as French, Danish, Portuguese constitution and law, and also in some other countries in Asia, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, etc. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. May I give the floor to Excellency Naisomol, Permanent Representative to the UN in Geneva.
Thank you, Mr. Head of Delegation, for giving me the floor, and also thank you, Mr. Vice President. I observe that some distinguished delegates prioritize civil and political rights over economic, social, and cultural rights when addressing Cambodia issues, where these two fundamental groups of rights should not be treated differently. As a result, for Cambodia economic growth, which came from the hard-earned peace under the win-win policy of Samdech Prime Minister Hun Sen, have been underestimated, whereas Cambodia's few mediocre shortcomings have been over-exacerbated. Therefore, for Cambodia, peace is a prerequisite for development that the government must defend at any price in order to uphold people's prosperity and rights, particularly economic and social rights. Having said that, does not mean we ignore other rights and freedoms. We listen to all concerns raised, but those concerns should be undertaken based on mutual respect. Any dialogue bearing insulting or humiliating character or politicization in nature is not welcome. UPR process is not a forum for launching political propaganda for the benefit of one group or one political party at the expense of others. Human rights should not be politicized. It should be applied in a fair and impartial manner. one should subject one's own country or group to the same standard applied on others. As for Cambodian citizens, they are equally treated before law, irrespective of their status or political affiliation. They are entitled to countless rights and freedom, including freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and of association, among others. But those rights and freedom shall be performed with special duty and responsibility, taking into account others' rights, national security, public order, as stated by Article 19 of the ICCPO. I thank you, Mr. Head of Delegation.
Mr. Vice President, I would like to give the floor to Excellency Soksakan, representative from Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Head of Delegation. Mr. Vice President, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, for Cambodia, this year represents the 40th year of liberation and our 20th year of genuine peace and national unity achieved through the win-win policy. From the first general election brokered by the United Nations in 1993 to 4 consecutive elections organized by Cambodians, the society is proving itself to be on course in an irreversible and peaceful democratization process. The latest 5th legislature election in July 2018 was held in free, fair, credible, and transparent manner. The fact that it was run smoothly with zero occurrence of violence is historically remarkable. Even more astounding is the fact that 83% of more than 8 million registered voters cast their ballots. This represents an excellent rate of participation, even compared to many more advanced democracies. The fact that there were a number of blank votes also signifies the secrecy of the vote and political freedom of choice of the people. Unlike in the past, during the recent election campaign period, political debates were civilized exchanges and were not tainted by hate speech, incitement of racism, populism, and ultra-nationalistic rhetoric. No one can dispute the will of the overwhelming majority of the registered voters who went to the ballot to freely express their choice. The choice of the Cambodian nation, a sovereign nation, must be respected. Disingenuously ignoring the technical quality of the electoral process is tantamount to displaying the utmost contempt for the will of the Cambodian people expressed through the 6,956,900 ballots. 6,956,900 ballots. Doing so casts doubts on the genuine sincerity of those critics to witness Cambodia further consolidating its democracy while enjoying the longest peace in modern history and consistent sustainable development. In terms of the contribution to the international community, Cambodia, which used to be politically and economically isolated, is now actively integrating itself into both regional and global structure and architecture, and playing an active role in all regional and international affairs on equal footing and with equal rights as other nations. Emerging from war and having directly suffered from its devastating effects, Cambodia is keen in supporting peace endeavors around the world because we understand clearly that without peace, all human rights will be deprived. Cambodia is the first post-conflict nation in the history of UN's peacekeeping operation that could turn itself from a recipient state of PKO forces into a dispatching state. Since 2006, Cambodia has sent almost 6,000 troops on UN peacekeeping missions to 8 countries and has even suffered casualties in its noble duty. Every year, Cambodia sends more than 800 soldiers to relieve personnel on peacekeeping duty, making Cambodia's ASEAN's 3rd largest contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. And for sending female officers to UN mission abroad, in 2017, the United Nations ranked Cambodia as the 1st in ASEAN and 2nd in Asia after South Korea. As a committed and active member of the United Nations system, Cambodia has been elected to hold the positions as member of the United Nations Economic and Social Council for the term of 2019 and as Vice President of the 73rd session of the General Assembly 2018-19. Cambodia has also played a very active role in multilateralism-based diplomacy. For instance, Cambodia was previously elected chair of the World Heritage Committee in 2013 and hosted the 37th session in Phnom Penh. In 2017, the international community entrusted Cambodia for another term as chairperson of the UNESCO Committee for Protection of Cultural Property Rights in the event of armed conflicts. This expression of confidence by the international community reflects the decades of commitment to cultural revival of our country, with the inscription of 3 sites on the World Heritage List, 5 elements in the Intangible Cultural Heritage List, and 1 of the Memory of the World International Register. Moreover, the international coordinating committees for Angkor and Prabir are also highly regarded as successful models of multilateral cultural management in close collaboration with the UNESCO, partner states, and relevant body. Further success is exemplified by the establishment of the hybrid court extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, or the Khmer Tribunal, under the close collaboration with the United Nations and the Royal Government of Cambodia in achieving justice for the population for atrocity committed during the genocidal regime, and as a country traumatized by ruthless geopolitically driven bombings and wars, Cambodia has made transformative progress in safeguarding and promoting our social, cultural rights and social justice. The Royal Government of Cambodia reiterates its unwavering commitment in strengthening peace, political stability, security and social order, promoting rule of law, human rights and dignity, liberal multi-party democracy, and implement concrete measures to enhance our people's livelihoods and welfare across generations. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, delegates, and ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. I'd like to pass the floor back to the head of the delegation for his concluding remarks. Please.
Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegate, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, to achieve our aspiration for 2030 and 2050 to become a modern society where people can enjoy peace and harmony without recurrence of war and genocide, we have highlighted in our national report many measures we have taken to ensure social economic inclusion, sustainable society and people-centered development by maintaining our commitment through numerous reforms across the board. Without doubt, human rights are inalienable, and we recognize that there is always room to improve human rights protection. It is this end that Cambodia is always placed good governance at the core of its policy. We are appreciative to delegates for all genuine attention, comments, and recommendations in this open, constructive, and cooperative dialogue. We have listened attentively to all intervention, and we are grateful to delegate and recognition of the progress made by Cambodia over the last 5 years. While objective expressing understanding to the challenges facing Cambodia as the least developed country torn by war and genocide, on behalf of Cambodian delegation, I would like to sincerely thank all interested countries, and we seriously consider those comments and recommendations that are made in a good faith for the genuine progress of human rights in Cambodia. While we have shown clear commitment to implement and create awareness of human rights, we regret to hear numerous issues raised that do not truly represent our situation, especially in the area of civil and political rights. In this regard, we will continue to work closely with the relevant stakeholders in a collaborative manner in accordance with the established law in order to safeguard the interests of both the majority of our citizens and also those from minority and marginal groups. We take note of all concerns raised and hope that relevant countries will abide to principle and stop politicizing issues of concern. Having said this, we won't accept those politically driven recommendations that are based on biases with complete disregard of fact and our national condition. It is our duty to safeguard our sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace, security and development based on respect for international law, but it should be recalled that in Cambodia as elsewhere in the world, the exercise of freedom, especially opinion of expression, is not absolute and must subject to recognition and respect for right and freedom of others. Freedom of expression is not the same as freedom to insult, to lie and fake information, or to defame or discredit individual or institution organizations. Statements inciting hatred, xenophobia are prohibited. That is why there are laws and regulations to sanction such practices. As in many other countries in the world, including those who are criticizing Cambodia. Mr. Vice President, let me reaffirm that the Royal Government of Cambodia attaches great importance to the UPR and will continue to uphold the principle of the UPR with its non-confrontational, non-politicized and non-selective approach. We would like to encourage members to view Cambodia's significant progress in an objective manner while adhering to constructive dialogue and cooperation. In particular, we absolutely oppose the practice of using human rights as the pretext to interfere in internal affairs of others and to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity. Recognizing that human rights are the common aspiration of humankind, Cambodia is consistently committed to the promotion and protection of human rights in accordance with Cambodian national context and phase of development. We are determined to achieve sustainable goals in our pursuit for social progress so that every Cambodian will have the opportunity to embrace a higher attainment of every aspect of human rights. To conclude, I would like to thank Mr. Vice President, the Troika, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Secretariat of all countries for effort in this review, and we will seriously consider the various recommendations in light of the Cambodian situation and reality, and will present our response to the Council within the given time frame. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank His Excellency and the delegation for the presentation and participation in this review. The report of the review will be prepared by the members of the Troika, namely the representatives of Pakistan, Senegal and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In accordance with the procedure implemented in 2015, the recommendations section will be distributed in the afternoon on Friday, 1st February, for the adoption on the same day as from 5 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, 8 February 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 p.m. for the adoption of the recommendation section of the draft reports on the UPR of Slovakia, Eritrea and Cyprus. All participants are invited to be in the room on time. The meeting is hereby closed.